So what's hot at this year's PAX Gaming Expo in Melbourne? Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by CASA Systems, taking Australian technology to the global market. Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined in person this week by Alex Kidman, a man who slept on my couch last night just so he could make it bright and early to PAX in Melbourne today. Alex, how's the back?
Probably better than the legs after a day of walking around at PAX, to be honest.
Good call, good call. So this week is our big 249th episode. Yes, Vertical Hold has cracked the big 249, a milestone worth celebrating since we're not going to be in the same room next week. So to celebrate the big 249, we're coming to you direct from the PAX Gaming Extravaganza, having spent Saturday checking out the best of mainstream indie and retro gaming. We're joined in the Vertical Hold outside broadcast van by Kotaku editor Alex Walker. Alex, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
We're also joined by another longtime friend of the show, PC World editor Fergus Halliday. Fergus, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So it's a massive 3-day show here at Jeff's Shed in Melbourne. Alex, what's caught your eye?
Oh, God. I've been here a week for the Game Developers Conference at the start, before PAX. It's held in the same venue, and it's called GCAP, Game Connect Asia Pacific. So it's been interesting because there's been a lot of focus around Apple Arcade, particularly if you're hovering around a lot of the developers. Apple likes a lot of Australian iOS development. A lot of iOS games and apps do really well for them. Procreate is a big example, the drawing app that's made out of Tasmania. But also there's a lot of exclusives that were coming out. So I got to check out Crossy Road Castle, which is the latest game from Matt Hall and Hipster Whale. They made Crossy Road and Shooty Skies and Pac-Man 256. And in this case, it's not so much of it's kind of an endless runner, but it's more like an endless runner that's Mario Maker. So you can play single player, or you can play with up to 4 people through online or through connectors or something like that, controllers rather. And you're just going through these little platforming levels. They're about half the size of a normal Mario level, and you're just effectively trying to race to the end, and you've got a shared amount of 3 lives. So it's something that you can digest really quickly. It's got that Crossy Road charm, and it's quite simple and quite easy to play. And it's something when it comes out later this year through Arcade, I think people will just sort of play it in short commutes and things like that.
So how is that going to work from a developer perspective? If people aren't paying you for your game, what kind of deal have they worked out with Apple? And is it, as a developer, is it a good deal to be on Apple Arcade as opposed to just selling your game individually?
So the NDAs around Apple Arcade have been really, really strict. I know there's...
How unlike Apple?
No, well, even more so than that. I know there are some developers that were mid-development and they had to start developing their games for mobile, not even knowing that they had been signed up to Apple Arcade. They are beyond brutal. But the thing is, for what I keep hearing from a lot of the developers, is it's actually an incredibly good deal for them if you think about it from backing the cost of development. A similar example was when Epic Games Store basically gave $15 million to the makers of Control, Remedy Entertainment. Basically covered their development costs and bought a pre-guaranteed amount of upfront copies so they could just focus on making it. It took a lot of the stress and a lot of the risk out of game development. And for Apple Arcade, it's a similar thing. Apple is helping fund some of these studios to make games. It's how exclusives work, right? We want to buy you to work on your platform. And that's happened in, some of these cases. Now, we don't know precisely what the deal is because Apple and the developers won't talk about it, but the developers are very excited because, especially Australian ones, because it makes it a lot less severe if the game doesn't do well.
They're certainly keen on the idea. I mean, from chatting to some of the indie game developers just on the show floor here today, an awful lot of them were saying, we're hoping to get on Apple Arcade. We'd like to be on Apple Arcade. So whatever the terms are, they seem to be favourable in what is, let's face it, a fairly kind of brutal world of retail game development.
Yeah, and what we know from Google's equivalent to it is Google has it set up by time, so the amount of time that people on PlayPass will spend with games or apps, because Play Pass is more than just games, the more sort of revenue share will go back. Now, that seems the most likely model, but the main thing is most studios that have been talking about it have been looking at it from getting a project off the ground. That's what's been exciting for them. And when I spoke to Matt Hall, he said, it kind of freed us up from the stress of development too, because they didn't have to think about the monetization model in the design process, right? When something like Crossy Road was being made, they had to think about how they were going to embed video playing ads as part of general gameplay, so they could basically continue to fund it. You go, okay, if you're going to die quickly, there's a chance that ads might play, so that will help fund the cost of development, and we don't need to worry about in-app purchases too much. It's not a problem in Apple Arcade. You don't have in-app purchases, you don't have ads, so you don't have to think about it from a design level, and it makes it a lot easier. I think there was one quote that I heard from someone, and they didn't say it to me, but I'm nosy as all hell, so I heard it, which was basically, we get to make the games that we want to make, but it's just not with our money.
Not a bad deal if you can get it.
So, Fergus, having had a look at the indie section and also the more mainstream games, what kind of impact do you think this is going to have in the ability for the smaller studios to make bigger games? And how do you think Apple Arcade might change the industry maybe a little bit in the next few years?
I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating because it's not only going to change the way games are developed, it's also going to affect the way that people approach buying games, right? Because when I think of myself as like a core gamer, I'm not necessarily a person who would go out and spend $80, $100 on mobile games a year. But when you sign up for Apple Arcade, that's essentially what you're doing. And if the revenue share is based on time spent playing a game, I think it's also going to subtly, even if it does it to a more in the back end sort of sense, change the way that the games are designed, because they want to maximize time rather than investment, rather than rewarding that, I guess.
And in terms of those bigger games, an awful lot of what we're seeing here, I think, is largely stuff that, whilst it hasn't been on show in Australia before, is fairly well established in terms of the demos that we're seeing, things like Cyberpunk and Final Fantasy VII Remake and things like that. Anything particular caught either of your eyes in that more AAA space?
I think you actually mentioning Cyberpunk and Final Fantasy and a couple of others, not so much Watch Dogs Legion, but like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Hollow Knight Silksong, particularly Pokemon Sword and Shield. The effect of having all of those big name games, that there is a lot of hype around in different communities, and the lines for the theatre presentation for Cyberpunk in particular have been evident, that this is a much bigger show, even though it's not quite that way on the floor plan. Like, there's not more booths or anything, there's certainly not more space for each of the individual booths, but the flow of traffic on the expo floor particularly is a little more congested, because you've got these much bigger lines. There are a lot of games that are huge, and they're more anticipated. People want to see them more and more, and we don't even have things like, can you imagine if Death Stranding was here and you add that to the mix? And you've got things like surprise ones like Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, the MMO, which has like a lines and a huge sort of fan base of its own, which is off in the corner. The expo hall is way more packed than it has been since coming to the Melbourne Convention Centre, really, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. Like you said, Alex, this is the first time a lot of the games that have been shown to Australian consumers, even if they've been shown at events like E3 or Gamescom overseas. So getting into the show yesterday, I definitely took the chance to go out and check some of them out, having not had the chance to travel overseas. So I was able to have a look at Biomutant, which is a game I've been following for a couple years. It's sort of developed by a European developer, and it's sort of a post-apocalyptic action game where you play as sort of a mutant raccoon with a sword. It looks just incredibly zany and outlandish, and sitting down to play it, I was like shocked to discover it's basically as bizarre and janky as I wanted it to be. And if I had played it and was like, wow, this is a really clean, polished video game, I'd be like kind of disappointed. But it's hitting this real nice sweet spot of like, it's pretty unpolished, but it's still kind of charming in that you're playing this weird mutant raccoon, and there's like character creation. Like the person next to me was going through the character creator, and if you like change the intelligence stat to be like the priority, his head would just get bigger. Like, it's just incredibly funny, and you jump in and you're this little raccoon fighting all these other furry warriors with weapons, and you find a rocket fist and you can suddenly like launch yourself with it and knock doors off hinges. There's like a bubble mode where you just sort of roll around in a giant bubble and you just pick up enemies like Katamari Damacy. It's like I expected it to be really bizarre, but I was delighted to find it's still more bizarre than I expected. So that was my sort of unexpected delight, because I didn't know it would be on the show floor, and I've been wanting to play it for ages. I thought it was maybe in development trouble, since it had been in development for so long, and the developers have been kind of quiet about it. But that was a delight for me.
PAX also has a whole bunch of panels around gaming culture and concepts and ideas, and we were able to catch up with Nick Healy from the ABC to talk about those. Okay, so I'm chatting with Nick Healy from ABC Radio, and Nick, I've only been here at PAX for the day. You've been here doing a whole bunch of panels. In fact, I've been lucky enough to grab you in between panels. Tell me about the panel experience.
I think it's probably the most fun part of PAX. So, look, I love what's happening out there with all the exhibits and, sort of where tabletop games are taking place. But to me, it's getting in the mind of people who make games, who talk about games, who write about games. That's, to me, where I get really excited. So I tend to moderate the panel. So I'll come in and make sure that everything's flowing along. But I love getting the audience to kind of participate a bit. I love seeing their reaction to a favourite reviewer or a favourite game maker and getting that inside story. And we just did one a little bit earlier that was heaps of fun called Faking It, where reviewers pretended to dislike games, and then the audience can have this whole bit where they can talk about the game they don't like, that's an unpopular opinion, and we make them feel better about having a bad opinion about a game. It's just weird and fun. I just think it's where the whole panel experience is where you really lift the curtain a little bit on how games get talked about, games get made, how stories about games get made, shows about games get made, and I think the audience really appreciate that.
There's a lot of creativity in the panel ideas as well. I mean, you were doing one earlier, which I tried to get into, it was just so crowded I couldn't get near on D&D, for example.
There's almost so much weird stuff. So that was the great debate, and the topic was the amount of D&D in the world these days is too damn high, which is just hilariously weird and awfully convoluted, and it was hard to remember whether we were negative or affirmative. But no, I like that, and you're right, there's got to be some great creativity, and we've had some really fun panels over the years. Like I did one a few years back called Why Good Games Make Bad Movies, and we found all those old, terrible Double Dragon, Dead or Alive, all that sort of stuff, and just dissected about why these were such bad movies when the games had been really good. And that's where that's got to be. There's so many theatres around, you've got to be really creative and have a lot of fun with it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.
So one of the things I've been really impressed with is a lot of the indie game scene here and just the variety of games that's on offer. Lots and lots of games based around cats for some reason. Now, I'm a sucker for games around cats, but there's one titled Unfamiliar, which is basically just this really gentle, chill game where you're this cat wandering around collecting stuff. It's not a really challenging thing, but it's just really quite delightful to play. The appallingly titled Chuck Meowrus.
That may win pun of PAX. It's up there. It's been nominated.
A sliding puzzle game called Necograms, which was quite good fun. But the game that actually really grabbed my attention was a thing called Sacrificial Lamb, which is basically a game about demon-possessing sheep and then using them for resource harvesting. So if you think kind of really, really cute, fluffy animals crossed with Don't Starve, It's quite extraordinary as a concept, and it's very, very unpolished. They're very early in their coding here. But what they've got is really engaging, and it's one of those things that could just fall over as a really blatant, brutal joke. But so far, it seems to work, and I'm really keen to see where they go with that. The creativity on show that we've got from Australian developers is really kind of fascinating and engaging. We're not just kind of making games packaged up for big publishers anymore, and I think that's great.
There's also a lot of really clever technical development with some of the games as well. Something that I had a little play of, and which was great because I had an interview with the developer for its announcement, was Wrestle Dunk Sports. Now, this was a game that was made by the creator of Hacknet, which was a sort of a largely text-based prompt game about hacking, and it was kind of very intricate. But when the creator made that, Matt Triabani, he didn't really like the mechanics of it. He found, like, when he ran a modding session for Hacknet, so he's like, okay, I want to do something different as a designer. So he wanted to make a sports game, and he wanted to make something that was very precise in its input. So to have a really good online netcode, especially for indie games, is really hard. So what WrestleDunk does is the game runs in this 240 frames per second deterministic space. and it effectively pans out, and it has a whole bunch of predictive elements on what players can and can't do in any given moment. And then if it doesn't work out, then it will roll back to like the most accurate scenario. So that way, when you're pressing, an input, you get knocked down or you try and get up, then it tries to offer the most accurate, close to as possible from you pressing the button from when it goes into an online lobby. A lot of other systems, Street Fighter has something very similar. A lot of other games have a lot of latency, but they don't have very good predictive mechanisms. So if you get a little bit of extra lag, it compounds and it compounds and it compounds. And it's not very good, especially when you've got like small multiplayer, bases in, say, like Australia or Southeast Asia or, Taiwan or something like that. So you need a really good rollback system to be able to deal with that cross-region play. And that one person can build this in a tiny sports party game, is insane. But
wonderfully insane.
It is wonderfully insane. And the fact that it's doable, I think, also shows, the range of Australian developers, because we often think about them in terms of what we can see, or something like Goose Game, that's zany, something like Unpacked in Queensland, that's really cool, it's colourful, but we don't often think about the engine development.
I was reading recently about something called negative latency. Yeah, I know, and everyone's just shook their head. A terrible name, but it sounded like a little bit of the same kind of concept of what you're talking about figuring out what's going to happen and working back and tying it all together, and that's how they were going to cut down on the lag and cloud gaming.
Yeah, that's so that came from an engineering of or VP of engineering from Google. It was working on Google Stadia, and I mean it's not the term negative latency is terrible and needs to die.
Appalling.
The general principle behind it is not actually that bad. There's been a lot of work being done by the big tech companies, particularly AMD, because they're providing a lot of the hardware and all of the CPUs and GPUs for Stadia now, and they're trying to work out how they can deliver frames differently to combat the latency problem. And logically, some of it is actually quite easy. If you get knocked down in a fighting game, right, and it comes to a certain amount of frames, there are a very limited amount of inputs that you can make in that given scenario. It might be a case of as soon as a hit is registered, you go into sort of a response animation, and that will lock your character up for, say, maybe 4, 8, 10 frames, whatever the game happens to be. So you can actually quite accurately predict what's going to come next and then deliver that a little bit faster than you would otherwise. And I think as they start to build in more AI and machine learning on how these games work, the predictive work on online netcode is actually going to get really smart. And that's kind of what Stadia is using, not just for, we think about it, online games, everything in Stadia is an online game, but Stadia you'll also play single player games and things like that, and they'll have to use a very similar technique to make those more playable as well. So it's kind of generally, it's much more technical, there's a lot more work that goes into it. Unfortunately they ruined it with a stupid term, but that's basically what they're getting at.
So speaking of tech in games, the big thing for a couple of years was VR. You come to PAX and every second stand would have a HTC Vive running something or other. Fergus, have we passed peak VR, do you think? I've noticed that I've seen less VR on the floor this year than in the last few years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the technology, I think, has gotten so much better than it was a few years ago, but at the same time, it feels like the wave of every indie developer trying to mess with VR has kind of tapered out a bit. The HTC have the Cosmos here, which is cool. It's cool that they're still making VR headsets.
I'm sorry, what is the Cosmos for those playing along at home?
It is their new VR headset. It features inside-out tracking. It's sort of, I guess, vaguely a competitor with the Rift S in a way. So it's really cool to actually see them get out and show it to people, given how, I guess, underrepresented the marketing for HTC has been lately. Because I imagine unless you're really deep in VR, you may have not even heard that the Cosmos was announced. So it's interesting they're marketing it, but also I've seen a lot of Oculus hardware around as well, particularly for smaller demos and stuff where the Go or the Quest can work because there's no wires, it's inside-out tracking, so it's easier to set up. So I think it still has a place, but it's definitely on, I guess, a decline compared to previous years.
Did we really need things like inside-out tracking, which my understanding is that means you don't need external cameras around the room, and also being self-contained, so you're not attached to a computer. We were always going to have to tick off those two boxes before we could go to the next level?
I think so, yes, because ultimately a big barrier to VR is having to set up those external sensors because you need physical space to accommodate them, and also wires. Wires are bad. People don't like wires. So having less wires is immediately better, and even if you have to deal with the battery life constraints that come along with stuff like the Quest and the Go and the Cosmos. Incorrect. Cosmos is still wired, I believe. But even if you have to deal with battery life, realistically, most people aren't going to use a VR headset for more than 3 hours at a time. So it kind of works out in the wash a bit. But also, in addition to those things, they've also increased the comfort and usability of everything there as well. Yeah, one thing that did catch my eye, even though I haven't actually been to the indie section proper yet, was the announcement of Summerfall Studios' first game, Chorus, which I believe was announced yesterday. And Summerfall is sort of like a new venture by a former BioWare lead writer, I think, David Gator, and also Liam Eisler, who was responsible for a bunch of... there was a convention called GX Australia a few years ago. And so it's a sort of collaboration between the two of them. Austin Wintory is doing the soundtrack and a bunch of voice actors, and it's sort of their debut title, very much inspired by stuff like Dragon Age and stuff like that. It's an urban fantasy game called Chorus, and they're pitching it as the first adventure game musical.
There's three words I didn't necessarily expect to hear together.
I already had pretty high expectations for what yeah, I have no idea what to expect there, but I had high expectations given the talent involved about when they started teasing that they would be announcing their first project at PAX. So it was absolutely delight to see them do something that's kind of unlike anything else, even within the adventure game genres, even within the dating sim elements that look like they'll be incorporating, and they're also crowdfunding it through Fig, I believe, rather than Kickstarter, due to some of the anti-union stuff that Kickstarter's been embroiled in lately. But it looks really cool. There's a neat trailer out. The art looks incredible for it. I'm hoping I can talk to someone about it tomorrow because I'm keen. Give me that musical.
Of course, they always have an amazing retro gaming section here at PAX, and we held the first annual Vertical Hold Gaming Tournament at my house last night on my modded arcade 1-up. I came out strong with 1942. Alex then decimated me in Donkey Kong, and it was kind of touch and go in Galaga, but I think we have to award the first award to Alex. So Alex, you spent some time in the retro gaming there. What were the classics that caught your eye?
So many classics. I spent an awful lot of time, and that won't surprise anyone who knows me whatsoever. It was great actually to catch up with a lot of the people from Australia's fine retro gaming community who otherwise I kind of only knew via social media. So that was quite good fun. It was also kind of humbling having bested you in 2 out of 3 falls to then fail mightily at every gaming competition that I entered there. Although that was also still good fun, and I think I did Vertical Hold proud. We were kind of middle of the pack. We weren't last.
We can live with that.
Yeah, I think we can live with that for now. But I mean, just
as long as we beat Mark Fennell.
Lots of really, lots of classic titles that are going to bring people in. A lot of really interesting pinball games, including some really older pinball games. We're talking stuff that goes back to the 1930s, 1940s, as well as some of the more current machines. And I think a slightly more relaxed vibe than a lot of the rest of the floor. And we were talking earlier about how there were big queues for lots and lots of things there. In the retro gaming area, there were queues, but there were like 2 or 3 people, so you really didn't have to wait too long to have a go on something. There was a very good kind of give and go vibe to all of it, even within the competitions. I was in a Super Mario World competition with a set of custom levels, which were fairly tough, but everyone was just kind of guiding everyone along. It was nice to see. It was a really good community gaming thing, and I think there's an awful lot of that around PAX generally as well. But I'm always up for anything that really kind of pushes that retro gaming message.
So, Alex Walker, you've been to more gaming conventions than I have. Is it just my imagination, or does PAX have a different feel to the others? Like, I've been to Tokyo Game Show, and it felt like half of this. It felt like the big flashy half, but it didn't have the retro gaming bit down the back. It didn't have the tabletop section. It didn't have those other sections where it just slows down a bit. It's for people who just want to try out games and play games. PAX has a bit of a different feel, doesn't it?
That was always kind of how it was set up too, right? Because it was built around the idea of the Penny Arcade founders and the comics, and obviously since the show's moved on since then, and it's it's its own thing, and it's really detached from the comics in a large way, but it's still kept that very community vibe. It's had a good mix between the expo hall and the tabletop section, and the expo hall not sort of cannibalizing any of its space or sort of setting it up in a way that it kind of detracted from the vibe there. Yeah. And the panels have always been really good. Like, even in years where they were quieter years for gaming and there weren't a lot of big showing from the major publishers, panels would be stacked with really good topics. They would have like a good variety of them as well, and especially touching on a lot of diversity or a lot of like different technical things or histories of games or fun interactive things. So PAX has always understood what it is very well. A lot of other shows are almost like kind of like online shopping, but like in a convention hall. You know, you're sort of there being sold to. Maybe there's a bit of cosplay on the side, but it's really just very merchandise, retail focused. Here, pay $50 for someone's signature. Like, no, I don't want to do that. And they're finding one of the most interesting things. The other week, PwC put out their entertainment and media outlook, and that covers a lot of games now, because games is the largest form of entertainment. Not so much if you actually count merchandising, that Hollywood's still bigger there, but what's happening in games is very much an important part of the Aussie media landscape. And something that PwC are focusing on a lot particularly is the live gaming experiences that can't be replicated at home. They know from an esports perspective that people will go and take about $600 to, say, something like IEM Sydney to go and stack up, but it's the same with something like PAX Australia, right? Like, people will come in, they'll go to the EB booth even though they've got an EB at home. They'll get a lot of collector's figures. They'll get a ton of, merch from different, stalls, or pins or things like that. Yeah,
all the pins.
And they stack up on them. But then you've also got these things like the game orchestras and all of the other. Disney's got a thing with the Void, which is kind of like a zero latency type VR reality thing. And more people are starting to realize from a business perspective of curating these special experiences that have something that's more than just selling to people. Because if you're just selling to people, you can just get that experience online. You just go buy it, you just go import it. So PAX is in a good spot because it has a lot of that community vibe that doesn't make it feel like it's something you can get somewhere else. And that means PAX will always be in a good spot. It'll certainly be in a good spot next year because PlayStation and Sony have to market very hard with the PS5 and whatever Project Scarlet ends up being. And then Nintendo when the next Nintendo Switch pops up. And it's a good time. I think it's come around. I think this has been a really good show so far.
So that's about it for a very special 249th episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Alex for joining us. Now, if we want to grab you on social media or online, where can we find you?
So if you want to find my fine postings, kotaku.com.au, or if you just want to see the terrible things I post on Twitter, Dippizuka, DIPPIZUKA.
And Fergus, same question to you.
You can find my work on www.pcworld.com.au, and you can follow me on Twitter at CVAMPED, CVAMPED.
And you can find my work on the 1942 cabinet right now in the classic arcade section, which last time I looked, I had the high score. So let's hope it's still there tomorrow.
Not that he's boasting, but you can also, of course, contact us at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And thanks everyone for listening. We always appreciate you tuning in and the shout outs you give us on social media. And thanks for helping us put out the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly sponsored by Casa Systems, taking Australian technology to the global market.